Jacob Lewis had always been a quiet man, a bit of a stoic figure in his mid-40s. He was the kind of person who prided himself on routine: wake up at 5:30 a.m., a quick breakfast with his wife Martha, head to work, come home by 6, and spend time with their two children, Emma, 14, and Caleb, 11. They lived in a quiet, suburban town in the Midwest, where everyone knew each other's business and life moved at a predictable pace. His family was well respected in the community, and his business, a small but successful hardware store, had been passed down through generations. People trusted Jacob, respected him for his steady work ethic and reliability. He was a man who rarely stirred the pot. But that was about to change. It started with a conversation one evening after dinner, when the house was quiet and the children were engrossed in their tablets. Martha, who had been talking about it for months, finally broached the subject she had been eager to discuss. "Jacob," she began cautiously, "what do you think about adopting?" Jacob, taken off guard by the question, put down his plate. He wasn't opposed to the idea of adoption, not exactly. But he'd never given it serious thought before. He had a full house, a good life, and everything seemed to be moving along just fine. He had his own children, and he was already busy with the store. "Adopting?" he repeated, thinking through the logistics. "Well, we have Emma and Caleb, and I think we're doing just fine." Martha, always the more compassionate one, gently disagreed. "I've been thinking about it a lot. We have space, and there are so many kids out there who need homes. What if we could help give one of them a better life? It's a big decision, but it feels right. We could be a family to someone who doesn't have one." Jacob looked at her, seeing the earnestness in her eyes. He understood her passion for helping others. It was one of the reasons he loved her. But the idea of adding a child to their family felt like a huge leap, especially considering the way the world worked. They were a typical white family in a small town with mostly white neighbors. He'd never thought of raising a child of another race. It wasn't that he was racist, but the thought of adopting a black child felt like stepping into uncharted waters. What would the community think? What would people say? Would they be judged for doing something so unconventional? Jacob sighed, rubbing his hand across his forehead. He loved Martha deeply, and he knew she wasn't going to back down. They had a life built on love, but adopting a child would change everything. The uncertainty loomed before him, like a storm cloud on the horizon. A few weeks passed, and the thought of adoption gnawed at Jacob's mind. He couldn't get the idea out of his head. They visited a local adoption agency one afternoon, and after some emotional discussions, they decided to take the plunge. They would adopt. But not just one child, two. The agency had a sibling pair, two brothers, Marcus, 9, and Isaiah, 7, who had been in foster care for several years. Both were black, and the more Jacob read about their story, the more his heart broke for them. Their parents had struggled with addiction, and both boys had faced neglect and abandonment. They were sweet boys, but the emotional scars from their turbulent past were deep. The agency emphasized how important it was to keep them together as siblings, which Jacob could understand. "We're doing this," he thought to himself. He wasn't just changing the lives of two boys, but the trajectory of his entire family. Yet, every step forward felt like a step into unknown territory. He couldn't help but wonder how his life would be impacted by this decision. The day they brought Marcus and Isaiah home was both exhilarating and overwhelming. As they pulled into their driveway, Jacob's heart pounded. He had no idea what to expect, but his instinct was to protect and care for these boys, who had been through so much. Marcus, tall for his age, stood at the door of the car with a nervous look on his face. Isaiah clung to his side, eyes wide, taking everything in. Both boys looked like they had been through a lifetime of hardship in their short years. Jacob smiled at them, his nerves trying to calm themselves. "Welcome home," he said softly. "You're safe now." The boys exchanged wary glances but nodded, their small bodies tense. It was clear they didn't trust easily. That night, they ate dinner in silence, and Jacob felt the weight of the situation pressing on him. The room felt different, unfamiliar, even though it was their family's home. He could tell Martha was feeling the same way. She kept glancing at the boys, unsure of what they needed, hesitant to make them uncomfortable. As the days passed, the reality of their decision began to sink in. The first few weeks were full of adjustments, moments of joy mixed with the tension of unfamiliarity. The boys didn't always understand their new home life. Simple things like table manners or bedtimes were foreign to them. But what shocked Jacob most wasn't just the boys' behaviors, it was the community's reaction. At first, people were polite, but there was an undercurrent of skepticism that Jacob couldn't ignore. At the hardware store, a regular customer who'd known Jacob for years looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "Two boys, huh? Well, I guess it's nice you're giving them a chance," the man said, though his tone was laced with uncertainty. Jacob wasn't sure how to respond. What did that even mean? Giving them a chance? Like they were some kind of charity case? As time passed, the comments got more pointed. "You're sure about this, Jacob? It's a lot of responsibility, especially with kids from that background," one neighbor said, shaking his head. Jacob was taken aback by the subtle racism, but he didn't confront it. He didn't know how to. His own mind wrestled with questions. Could he really raise two black boys in a town where the only people of color were visitors passing through? How would the boys be accepted? And yet, Jacob pushed forward. Martha supported him every step of the way, but even she could feel the strain. The isolation grew. Friends distanced themselves. Some began avoiding their home altogether, leaving just Jacob, Martha, Emma, and Caleb to navigate this new chapter on their own. The weight of being a trailblazer in a town that hadn't even considered what it meant to raise kids of another race pressed heavily on Jacob's shoulders. But he had made a decision, and there was no turning back. Still, as he looked at Marcus and Isaiah, he couldn't help but wonder, had he made a huge mistake? Would he regret this decision in the years to come, or would the love he had for these boys be enough to bridge the gap between them and the world that would surely judge them? The answer seemed elusive, but one thing was clear: this was just the beginning of a journey that would test everything Jacob thought he knew about family, race, and what it meant to truly belong. The first few weeks of adjusting to life with Marcus and Isaiah felt like a blur to Jacob. It was a whirlwind of trying to get the boys comfortable in their new home, dealing with the everyday challenges of school and routine, while also grappling with the weight of the doubts and whispers from their community. They had settled into their new house, a home that now felt like it was teetering on the edge of something both beautiful and fragile. Marcus, the older of the two, had an innate quietness to him, a sort of protective shield that seemed to hold him back from fully opening up. He would sit in his room for hours, drawing or reading, avoiding eye contact. Isaiah, on the other hand, was more expressive, more willing to engage, but there was a rawness to his emotions. He would cry at night, sometimes for no apparent reason, his small body shaking with the kind of grief Jacob couldn't begin to understand. Jacob and Martha did their best to give the boys space when they needed it, but also made sure they felt loved and wanted. They never forced affection, but the quiet moments of connection, a gentle hand on a shoulder, a shared look between Jacob and Marcus when a joke was told, or the way Isaiah's face would light up when they'd play catch, were the small victories they cherished. The boys were clearly struggling with the trauma of their past lives, but the walls they had built around themselves slowly began to crack. They were beginning to trust Jacob and Martha, little by little, but it wasn't easy. Sometimes they would regress, and it felt like everything they had built up in one day would be torn down in an instant the next. Jacob began to see the complexities of raising two children who had lived through neglect and uncertainty. There were the behavioral issues. Isaiah was prone to sudden outbursts, throwing things when frustrated, or pulling away from conversations entirely. He couldn't understand how to express his anger without it spilling over into destruction. Marcus was quieter but equally withdrawn, often reluctant to get involved with family activities, isolating himself in a corner or retreating to his room when tensions rose. Jacob had never been a soft man. He was practical, focused, and relied on steady routines. But he had to adapt, shifting his approach to accommodate the deep emotional needs of two children who were still processing the pain of their pasts. He knew, in those first months, that what he was doing, what they were all doing, was nothing short of heroic. It was harder than he ever could have imagined. Still, it wasn't just the boys who had to adjust, it was the whole family. Emma, their biological daughter, had been excited about the adoption at first. She talked about it for weeks, imagining what it would be like to have brothers, sharing her room, and teaching them all the things she loved. But as the reality set in, it became clear that Emma wasn't as prepared as she had thought. The boys weren't easy to get along with. They didn't understand the concept of sharing. They would fight over toys, argue over who got to sit in the front seat of the car, or take turns on the TV remote. Emma found herself growing frustrated, even resentful, at times. She felt like her parents were always focused on the boys' needs, leaving her to fend for herself in a new, strange family dynamic. Caleb, too, was struggling with the transition. At 11, he was old enough to understand that the boy's past was difficult, but he didn't know how to deal with the changes in his own life. He missed the way things used to be, simpler, with just the four of them. He started to act out at school, not wanting to come home some days, complaining about the noise, the disruption. Both Emma and Caleb were now forced to take on the role of older siblings in a family that had been upended, and while they both did their best, it wasn't without frustration. Jacob could feel the strain. His own anxieties were mounting. Every time Marcus would withdraw into silence, he'd wonder if the boy was slipping further away from them. Every time Isaiah would act out, Jacob would question whether he was doing enough to help him heal. It was hard for Jacob not to take it personally. When people in the community noticed the changes, their opinions were not always kind. There was the occasional comment about the troubled kids being too much of a handful, or the whispers about how this adoption might not work out. Jacob tried to ignore it, but it weighed on him. He couldn't escape the feeling that, no matter how much love and care he gave to Marcus and Isaiah, it wasn't going to be enough to change some people's minds. The most painful moments, however, were when the boys themselves showed their struggle with being accepted. Marcus was often quiet and avoided interaction with kids at school, which made him an easy target for bullying. Isaiah, with his fiery temper, had trouble making friends and frequently got into conflicts. Jacob could see the signs, the subtle slights, the cruel comments from classmates, the glances from teachers that seemed to say, "This is going to be a problem." It became apparent that even in the schoolyard, where every child should have a sense of belonging, Marcus and Isaiah were treated as outsiders. One afternoon, Jacob received a call from the principal. Marcus had gotten into a fight with another student after being taunted for his skin color. The other child, a boy from a prominent family in town, had made a snide remark about Marcus's hair and how it looked funny. Jacob could feel his blood begin to boil as the principal explained the situation. It wasn't the first time Marcus had come home upset, but this time, it was different. There was a rawness in his eyes when Jacob saw him later that evening, as though the insult had cut deeper than the others. It wasn't just about the fight, it was about the isolation. It was about being treated like he didn't belong. As Jacob sat with Marcus that evening, trying to find the right words to comfort him, he couldn't help but feel the enormity of the situation. It wasn't just about parenting two boys with difficult histories, it was about fighting an entire system of prejudice that had been ingrained in the very fabric of the town. He knew Marcus and Isaiah needed more than just love, they needed protection, understanding, and a sense of belonging. They needed to know that no matter what the world threw at them, they had a family that would fight for them, a family that would stand by them in the face of judgment. The next day, Jacob went to the school, prepared for a confrontation. But when he arrived, the principal met him with an unexpected level of understanding. She had seen the way the boys were treated, had noticed the exclusion and the whispers. For the first time, Jacob felt like someone in authority was on his side. Together, they spoke with the other children involved, and the principal made it clear that any form of bullying, especially rooted in race, would not be tolerated. It was a small victory, but it was one that made Jacob feel like maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to navigate the storm that was brewing. Yet, as Jacob looked at Marcus later that night, he realized how deep the scars of racism ran, how even in a town that prided itself on being good people, there were so many unspoken prejudices that would not vanish with a single conversation. He knew that the journey was just beginning, and the weight of that knowledge felt like a heavy burden on his chest. But he wasn't about to back down. For Marcus and Isaiah, for his own children, and for the hope of a better future, Jacob had made a promise to himself that he would never stop fighting. As the months went by, the challenges continued, but something began to shift. The tension that had marked the early days of the boys' arrival slowly transformed into a sense of cautious optimism. Jacob and Martha had worked tirelessly to create an environment of stability for Marcus and Isaiah. They set clear boundaries, worked through the emotional upheavals, and, most importantly, showed the boys that love wasn't something that had conditions, it was something they could rely on. Yet, the outside world didn't make it easy. The whispers at the hardware store continued, and while Jacob tried to focus on his family, it was impossible not to hear them. It wasn't just the casual racism that stung, it was the microaggressions, the unspoken judgments, and the way people's attitudes, though sometimes subtle, made it clear that things weren't as simple as they seemed. One Saturday, Jacob was out running errands when he ran into an old friend, Tim, who had always been the kind of guy who believed in the way things should be. Tim, with his gruff demeanor and self-assured attitude, smiled when he saw Jacob, but the smile faltered the moment his gaze fell to Marcus and Isaiah, who were walking beside him. "I didn't know you were taking in kids from that background," Tim said, his voice betraying a hint of surprise and discomfort. Jacob felt his stomach tighten. He had never been one to confront people head-on, especially old friends, but something about Tim's words stung deeply. "They're my sons, Tim," Jacob said firmly, forcing himself to meet his friend's gaze. "And they're good boys. They've been through a lot, and they're part of this family now." Tim shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean anything by it. Just, well, I don't know if it's what you expected, you know? Raising kids like that, with everything they've been through." Jacob's pulse quickened. "They're not like that, Tim. They're kids who need a chance to grow up in a safe home. If you can't understand that, then maybe you're not the friend I thought you were." The conversation ended awkwardly, and as Jacob walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling of being judged, not just by Tim, but by a whole community that, for all its friendliness, didn't fully accept what he was doing. He knew it wasn't just about the boys' pasts, it was about their skin color, their race, and how their presence in a family like his challenged the comfort zone of so many people around him. Yet Jacob didn't back down. He couldn't afford to. Every time an incident like this happened, it became more clear that he wasn't just fighting for his sons, he was fighting for the kind of world they could grow up in, one that didn't judge them by their color, but by their character. In contrast, there were moments that were truly uplifting, times when Marcus and Isaiah showed signs of blossoming, of overcoming the odds. Marcus, who had initially been distant, began to open up in unexpected ways. He started taking an interest in the store, spending more time with Jacob, helping him with small tasks, and even showing off some of his own skills with tools. It was clear that Marcus had a natural talent for fixing things, something Jacob hadn't noticed before. Isaiah, for all his difficult behavior, showed signs of resilience. After weeks of pushing away affection, he finally began to let himself be comforted, seeking out Martha for hugs when he felt scared or uncertain. These small acts were monumental, and they showed Jacob that no matter how tough things got, the boys were slowly finding their way into the family. One evening, after a particularly exhausting week, Jacob decided to take Marcus and Isaiah to the local park to get some fresh air and clear his mind. They sat by the basketball court, where the local kids gathered every evening. It had been a while since they had interacted with other children their age, and Jacob could see the apprehension in both boys. Marcus stood at the edge of the group, keeping his distance, while Isaiah eyed the kids on the court suspiciously. Then, something surprising happened. One of the kids, a local boy named Derek, approached Marcus. "Hey, you wanna shoot some hoops?" he asked, his voice casual, unassuming. Jacob held his breath, unsure of how Marcus would respond. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Derek tossed him a ball, and the two boys began to shoot. It wasn't long before Isaiah, who had been watching from the sidelines, darted forward, eager to join in. Jacob stood back, watching as the two boys began to laugh and play. For the first time in months, the weight of their struggles seemed to lighten, if only for a moment. It wasn't just about basketball, it was about belonging. It was about the possibility of acceptance, not just by their family, but by the wider world. That night, as they walked back home, Marcus looked up at Jacob with a smile that stretched across his face. "Dad," he said, a small but powerful word that still carried so much weight. "I think I made a friend." Jacob's heart swelled with emotion. It was such a simple thing, yet it felt monumental. It was a sign that, despite everything they had faced, despite the difficulties, the isolation, and the prejudice, Marcus and Isaiah were finding their place. It was a sign that the world, though harsh, still had room for change, for growth, for connection. But that wasn't the end of the story. While Jacob had felt a glimmer of hope, the road ahead was still fraught with obstacles. He had seen firsthand how difficult it was to fight against ingrained prejudices, and the whispers in the community had not ceased. It wasn't just the kids at school who were struggling to accept Marcus and Isaiah, it was their teachers, their peers, and the wider community that remained resistant to change. Jacob's efforts to create a better life for his sons had only begun. The shift wasn't going to come easily, and every day was a battle to create a space where his boys could thrive. Yet, despite these challenges, Jacob began to realize something profound. This fight was not just about Marcus and Isaiah, it was about him, too. It was about growing as a person, about learning to navigate a world that was full of contradictions, about realizing that the most important thing wasn't always about fitting in, but about standing up for what was right. As a father, Jacob had always prided himself on being practical, on doing things the right way. But now, he was learning that sometimes, doing the right thing meant taking a stand against the tide, against the pressure to conform to old norms. One evening, after a particularly tough day, Jacob sat down with Martha. They were in the kitchen, a cup of tea in hand, discussing their day as they always did. But tonight was different. "Martha," Jacob said quietly, "I think we're really doing it. We're showing Marcus and Isaiah what real family means. I know it's hard, and I know we have a long way to go, but I think we're changing them. And maybe, in some small way, we're changing this town, too." Martha smiled, her eyes filled with the warmth that had always been her strength. "We're doing it together, Jacob. One day at a time." And so, they continued, knowing that their journey wasn't just about building a family, it was about changing hearts and minds, challenging stereotypes, and carving out a space where their boys, and all children, could grow up in a world that embraced them for who they were. Though the road ahead was still long, Jacob knew that he would never stop fighting for his family, for his sons, and for a future where love and understanding. As the months passed, the changes that Jacob had hoped for began to manifest in ways that surprised even him. What once seemed like an insurmountable struggle had started to take root in small, quiet victories. Marcus, though still reserved, began to show more of himself. His drawings, which he had once kept hidden away, began to fill the walls of their house. His talent was undeniable, intricate sketches of animals, landscapes, and abstract shapes that seemed to tell a story about his world, one Jacob hadn't fully understood until he saw it on paper. Every so often, Marcus would bring a drawing to Jacob, shyly asking, "Do you think it's good?" Jacob would smile, placing a hand on his shoulder, and say, "It's more than good, Marcus. It's beautiful." Isaiah, whose anger had often been his shield, started to calm. His outbursts, though not gone, were less frequent. His bursts of laughter became more common, and Jacob could see that Isaiah was no longer holding onto his pain as tightly as he once had. There were still moments of fear, of hesitation, times when Isaiah would pull back, as though afraid to get too close. But there were also moments when he sought out affection, when he asked for help with his homework or even showed an interest in learning how to ride a bike. That was a huge step, and Jacob felt his heart swell every time Isaiah reached out for that kind of connection. But even as things improved within their home, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the outside world was still a battleground. The school had been a source of stress since day one. Marcus and Isaiah's struggle to fit in had not gone unnoticed, and though there were positive moments, like the one in the park when Marcus had made a friend, the reality was that they still faced daily challenges in a world that often felt divided. Their teachers, though well-meaning, still didn't understand the depth of what the boys had been through. They tried their best, but without the proper tools and training to navigate the complexities of trauma, their efforts often fell short. One afternoon, Jacob received a phone call from the school. It was Mrs. Hargrove, Marcus's teacher, and she sounded concerned. Jacob's stomach tightened. As the months passed, the changes that Jacob had hoped for began to manifest in ways that surprised even him. What once seemed like an insurmountable struggle had started to take root in small, quiet victories. Marcus, though still reserved, began to show more of himself. His drawings, which he had once kept hidden away, began to fill the walls of their house. His talent was undeniable, intricate sketches of animals, landscapes, and abstract shapes that seemed to tell a story about his world, one Jacob hadn't fully understood until he saw it on paper. Every so often, Marcus would bring a drawing to Jacob, shyly asking, "Do you think it's good?" Jacob would smile, placing a hand on his shoulder, and say, "It's more than good, Marcus. It's beautiful." Isaiah, whose anger had often been his shield, started to calm. His outbursts, though not gone, were less frequent. His bursts of laughter became more common, and Jacob could see that Isaiah was no longer holding onto his pain as tightly as he once had. There were still moments of fear, of hesitation, times when Isaiah would pull back, as though afraid to get too close. But there were also moments when he sought out affection, when he asked for help with his homework or even showed an interest in learning how to ride a bike. That was a huge step, and Jacob felt his heart swell every time Isaiah reached out for that kind of connection. But even as things improved within their home, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the outside world was still a battleground. The school had been a source of stress since day one. Marcus and Isaiah's struggle to fit in had not gone unnoticed, and though there were positive moments, like the one in the park when Marcus had made a friend, the reality was that they still faced daily challenges in a world that often felt divided. Their teachers, though well-meaning, still didn't understand the depth of what the boys had been through. They tried their best, but without the proper tools and training to navigate the complexities of trauma, their efforts often fell short. One afternoon, Jacob received a phone call from the school. It was Mrs. Hargrove, Marcus's teacher, and she sounded concerned. Jacob's stomach tightened. "Mr. Hayes, I wanted to talk to you about Marcus. He's been having some trouble with his assignments, and I'm concerned. He seems distracted in class, and he's falling behind. Is everything okay at home?" Jacob knew that this was a delicate question. It wasn't the first time a teacher had asked about his sons, and he had always tried to be open about the challenges they were facing. Marcus is adjusting, Jacob said, his voice steady. He's been through a lot, and it's taking time. We're doing everything we can at home to help him, but sometimes it feels like the world doesn't understand what he's been through. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Hargrove wasn't unkind, but there was a clear undercurrent of frustration in her tone. I understand, Mr. Hayes, but I'm concerned that if we don't address this soon, Marcus's performance will continue to suffer. It's important that we stay on top of this. Jacob felt a wave of frustration wash over him. It wasn't the first time he'd been asked to fix his son, as though it was simply a matter of discipline or effort. It was as if the depth of Marcus's emotional scars wasn't being fully recognized. I understand your concerns, Mrs. Hargrove, but Marcus needs more than just academic support right now. He needs emotional understanding. I know it's a lot to ask, but he's not just a student. He's a child who's trying to rebuild after everything he's been through. The conversation ended on a somewhat strained note. Jacob knew he was being perceived as defensive, but he also knew he was fighting for his son's dignity. He couldn't afford to let anyone overlook the emotional complexity of what Marcus and Isaiah were experiencing. They needed more than just grades or classroom performance, they needed care, patience, and time. It was around this time that Jacob and Martha made a decision to seek out professional help. They began attending family therapy sessions, a step that neither of them had initially considered. The idea had seemed daunting at first, opening up about their struggles, admitting that they didn't have all the answers, but they quickly realized that it was necessary. The therapy sessions offered a space for Marcus and Isaiah to talk about their feelings in a safe environment, and it also allowed Jacob and Martha to better understand how to help their sons cope with their past trauma. During one particular session, Isaiah opened up in a way that took everyone by surprise. He had been quiet for most of the session, but when the therapist asked him about his fears, he began to speak in halting sentences. I'm scared, Isaiah said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared that one day, you won't want me anymore. I'm scared that one day, you'll leave me like everyone else. The room fell silent. Jacob's heart ached as he saw the raw vulnerability in Isaiah's eyes. In that moment, he understood the depth of the pain Isaiah had been carrying. It wasn't just about the anger, it was about abandonment, about the fear that he might never truly belong. Jacob reached out, placing a hand on Isaiah's arm. We're not going anywhere, Isaiah, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We're your family now. And no matter what, we're here for you. Isaiah didn't respond immediately, but Jacob could see the tears welling up in his eyes. For the first time, Isaiah seemed to believe him. It was a breakthrough, and Jacob knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in their journey. But even as they made progress, the community continued to present obstacles. Jacob had always prided himself on being a good neighbor, someone who helped out whenever needed. But as word of his adoption began to spread, he found himself facing subtle but unmistakable resistance from those around him. There were still people who whispered behind his back, people who looked at him with confusion or judgment. Some of the older folks in town couldn't hide their disapproval. Jacob could sense their discomfort, especially at community events. He'd hear the soft murmur of voices when he walked by, the looks that lingered just a little too long. The hardest part, though, was seeing how his children were affected. Marcus and Isaiah had begun to pick up on the undercurrent of judgment. Marcus, who had always been sensitive to his surroundings, became withdrawn again, more so than before. Isaiah's temper flared in response to the tension, lashing out at school and sometimes even at home. Jacob found himself wondering if the battle they were facing in the outside world would ever end. But then, one morning, something unexpected happened. Jacob was sitting at his usual spot in the local diner when he noticed a familiar face walk in, a woman he had known for years, Carol, the wife of one of his old friends. Carol was someone who had never been overtly unkind to Jacob, but she had always been distant, never really engaging in deeper conversations. Today, however, she walked up to his table with a warm smile, something Jacob hadn't expected. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, sitting down. "I've been thinking a lot about your family lately. You know, I've heard a lot of things. But I've also seen the way you're raising those boys. You're doing something good here. I just wanted you to know that." Jacob was taken aback. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. But as he looked at Carol, he realized that sometimes, change came in small, unexpected ways. It wasn't much, but it was a start. There would be more conversations like this, more moments of understanding and acceptance. Jacob knew that the fight wasn't over, that it might never be fully over. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a sense of hope. He wasn't just raising two boys. He was changing hearts, challenging perceptions, and building a future for his family, a future where, no matter what, his sons would never have to feel alone again. As Jacob's journey continued, the small victories that had begun to build up over the last year began to feel more substantial. The process was slow, painstaking, and often frustrating, but it was also undeniably transformative. He had always considered himself a patient man, but he had never faced a challenge quite like this. Raising two boys who had been through so much trauma required more than just love, it required a steadfast commitment to understanding, patience, and adaptability. And Jacob found himself growing, both as a father and as a person, in ways he hadn't anticipated. Marcus, despite his initial reticence, was now beginning to open up in a way that made Jacob and Martha proud. He had joined the local community center's art program, something he had been hesitant to try at first. But as he immersed himself in drawing and painting, Jacob noticed a subtle change in his son. The quiet boy who had once kept to himself began to communicate through his art. He would bring home pieces that spoke volumes about the struggles he had faced, jagged lines, dark shades, and symbols of his past. Yet there was beauty in these pieces, something raw and honest that told a story of survival. Every time Marcus handed over a new drawing, Jacob marveled at how much his son was telling him, without speaking a word. It was a breakthrough, a sign that Marcus was starting to process the pain he had buried deep inside. Isaiah, on the other hand, was a constant whirlwind of energy and emotion. He had made progress too, but his path was a little more complicated. His anger, though less explosive, still flared up unexpectedly, often over small things. Yet, for the first time, Isaiah had started to communicate when he was feeling overwhelmed. Instead of lashing out, he would pull away, retreating to his room or taking a walk to calm himself. And when he did get angry, he was learning how to express his feelings in healthier ways. There were still moments when the old defense mechanisms crept in, moments when Isaiah's walls went up and he became distant, but the difference was that Jacob could see the effort Isaiah was making to change, to trust. Martha, as always, was the steady force holding the family together. She never faltered in her belief that these boys were worth every bit of the struggle. When things got tough, when the outside world seemed like it was closing in on them, Martha was the one who reminded Jacob of the progress they had made, the small steps forward that meant everything. She had been the one to push them to seek therapy, to attend support groups, and to face their fears head-on. Yet, despite the progress they had made within their home, Jacob was constantly reminded of the uphill battle they faced in the world outside. The whispers didn't stop. At work, he still encountered subtle disapproval from colleagues, some of whom seemed to think his decision to adopt two black boys was a mistake. At town meetings, Jacob often overheard comments about how his family situation was unconventional, as if it were something that needed to be explained or justified. It didn't bother him the way it used to, but the fact that it persisted, years after the boys had arrived in their home, was disheartening. He found it difficult to reconcile the love and care he gave his sons with the prejudice he still encountered in the community. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jacob sat in his car outside the local grocery store, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He had just finished a tense conversation with an old neighbor, who had asked him, albeit in a polite but condescending manner, how the boys were adjusting to their new life. It was the same question he had been asked countless times before, but this time it felt different. It felt like an unspoken judgment behind the words, a subtle implication that the boys were somehow a problem to be fixed. Jacob closed his eyes, trying to let the frustration pass, but it lingered, like an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. He wasn't used to feeling like an outsider in his own town. Jacob had grown up in this community, had worked hard to build relationships with those around him. Yet, now, as the father of 2 black boys, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being treated like an anomaly, a curiosity. There were days when the judgment stung more than others, days when he wished he could simply walk away from it all, but he couldn't. He had made a commitment to Marcus and Isaiah, and there was no turning back now. The next morning, as Jacob sat down for breakfast with Marcus and Isaiah, he noticed something different in the way they looked at him. It was a quiet, subtle change, but it was there. Marcus, who had been distant just the day before, suddenly seemed eager to engage. He was talking about his artwork, about a new project he was working on at the community center. Isaiah, too, was animated as he recounted a funny moment he had with a friend at school. For a moment, Jacob allowed himself to relax, to enjoy the warmth of his family without the weight of the world pressing down on him. But just as quickly, that moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Hargrove, Marcus's teacher, standing on the doorstep, a warm smile on her face. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone slightly hesitant, "I wanted to apologize. I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation. And I realized I wasn't as understanding as I should have been. I've been working with the school counselor, and we've been discussing ways to support Marcus more effectively. I think he needs more than just academic help right now. He needs emotional support, and I want to make sure we're providing that." Jacob was taken aback. He had expected another round of subtle criticism or pressure to fix Marcus's academic performance, but instead, Mrs. Hargrove had taken the time to reassess the situation. It was a small victory, but to Jacob, it felt monumental. It was a sign that, slowly but surely, the community was starting to see Marcus and Isaiah for who they really were, not just as children of a father who had adopted them, but as real kids with real needs, struggling to overcome their pasts. Later that evening, Jacob and Martha talked about Mrs. Hargrove's visit. They were cautiously optimistic but knew the road ahead was still long. "Maybe," Martha said thoughtfully, "things are finally starting to change." Jacob nodded, though his thoughts were still clouded with doubt. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but he could see that progress was being made, however small it seemed. There would always be setbacks, always be moments when they felt like outsiders. But Jacob knew one thing for sure: his sons were his family, and no one could take that away from him. He was ready to face whatever came next, because for the first time in a long while, he truly believed that change was possible. The next morning, as the sun rose and the house came alive with the sounds of breakfast and laughter, Jacob looked at Marcus and Isaiah with a deep sense of gratitude. Their struggles were far from over, but they were moving forward, and that was enough. It was a reminder that the fight wasn't just about fighting for a better future for his sons, it was about standing up for love, understanding, and the possibility of redemption, not just for Marcus and Isaiah, but for everyone in the world around them. It would take time, it would take effort, and there would be moments when the road ahead seemed impossible. But Jacob knew that as long as they had each other, nothing could stop them from forging a new path forward. As the months slipped by, Jacob found himself in a constant state of reflection. The tension that had once consumed his every waking moment had, in many ways, given way to a quieter, more subtle kind of peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come all at once, but grows like a small flame, flickering and uncertain at first, but eventually burning steady and bright. His sons, Marcus and Isaiah, were no longer just victims of their circumstances, they had become active participants in their own healing. It hadn't been easy, and it wasn't perfect, but the progress they had made was undeniable. They were no longer defined by the trauma they had endured. Instead, they were beginning to define themselves on their own terms. One evening, as Jacob sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a stack of old photographs, he found himself reminiscing about the first day Marcus and Isaiah had walked into their home. He remembered the fear in their eyes, the tentative way they had stepped into the house as if they were unsure whether they could trust the space. And how, over time, those same eyes had softened, how those tentative steps had turned into confident strides. There were still moments of fear and doubt, of course, but now there were more moments of hope, more moments when Jacob saw the resilience in his sons, the strength they had inherited from surviving a world that had so often turned its back on them. It was a quiet evening when Marcus, now 16, approached Jacob with a request. "Dad, can I talk to you for a second?" he asked, his voice a little more confident than usual, though tinged with the familiar uncertainty that still lingered beneath the surface. Jacob put down the photograph he had been staring at and gave his son his full attention. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Marcus hesitated, fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve, but then he took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for something important. "I've been thinking a lot about my future," he said slowly. "About what I want to do, with my life." Jacob's heart swelled with pride as he listened. Marcus had always been more reserved, but over the last few months, he had started to express his thoughts and dreams more openly. "What do you want to do, son?" Jacob asked, his voice full of encouragement. "I want to become an artist. Like a real artist, you know?" Marcus said, his eyes lighting up. There was no trace of hesitation in his voice now, just a quiet certainty that filled the room. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He had seen the potential in Marcus's art from the very beginning, the way he could translate the turmoil in his heart into something beautiful on paper. And now, here was Marcus, claiming that gift, owning it for the first time. "I think you could do that, Marcus," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got the talent, and you've got the drive. If this is what you want, I'll do everything I can to help you get there." Marcus smiled, a small but genuine smile that spoke volumes. It wasn't just a smile of gratitude, it was a smile of possibility, of someone who was beginning to believe in themselves in a way they never had before. In that moment, Jacob realized how far they had come as a family. Marcus wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. Isaiah, too, had grown in ways Jacob hadn't expected. His anger, though still present at times, had become more manageable. He had started to talk more openly about his feelings, especially with Martha, who had a natural ability to help him process his emotions. Isaiah had been seeing a counselor for the past few months, and Jacob noticed a significant shift in him. He was less defensive, less guarded, and more willing to confront the feelings that had once been buried deep inside. The road wasn't without its setbacks, but Isaiah was beginning to open up in ways that felt like breakthroughs. There were still days when his temper flared, and days when he retreated into himself, but now, more than ever, he was learning to trust both Jacob and Martha, and himself. One evening, after a particularly challenging therapy session, Isaiah came to Jacob, his expression serious. "Dad, can I ask you something?" he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I've been thinking a lot about my birth parents. I know you've always been honest with me about them, but I don't know if I've ever really understood why they left. Like, what did I do wrong?" The question hit Jacob like a wave, and for a moment, he was at a loss for words. He had never really talked about the details of Isaiah's past in a way that Isaiah could truly grasp. But now, in this moment, Jacob realized that Isaiah wasn't looking for answers in the way he had in the past. He wasn't seeking blame or closure. He was simply searching for understanding. Jacob sat down beside him, his voice gentle but firm. "Isaiah, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes, people make decisions that don't make sense to us. Your mom and dad, they weren't ready to be parents. But that's not a reflection of you. You didn't do anything to deserve that. You're not broken, Isaiah. You're not broken. The look in Isaiah's eyes softened, just slightly, but it was enough. He nodded slowly, taking in Jacob's words. For the first time in what felt like years, Isaiah seemed to accept them, not as a platitude, but as a truth. And in that moment, Jacob knew that Isaiah, too, was beginning to heal. He was beginning to see himself for who he really was, not just as the boy abandoned by his birth parents, but as the son of a father who loved him without condition. But even as they made progress within their home, the reality of the outside world still loomed large. Jacob knew that no matter how much they had changed as a family, there would always be people who didn't understand. There would always be people who saw them as different, who whispered behind their backs or looked at them with judgment. But Jacob had come to a realization that was both liberating and humbling. It didn't matter what other people thought. What mattered was what happened inside their home, inside their hearts. One afternoon, as they sat around the dinner table, Marcus telling stories about his latest art project, Isaiah laughing at a joke he had heard at school, Jacob felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He realized that it wasn't just about surviving the outside world, it was about creating a sanctuary within their home, a place where love and understanding ruled, where the past didn't have to define their future. And as the days stretched into months, Jacob knew that the road ahead was still filled with challenges. There would be setbacks, difficult conversations, and moments of doubt. But he also knew that they were stronger than they had been before. His sons were no longer just survivors, they were becoming thriving young men with dreams, passions, and hopes for their futures. And Jacob, their father, was no longer just a man who had adopted them. He was their advocate, their protector, and their guide. Looking at Marcus and Isaiah, Jacob realized that they had all found something beautiful together, a sense of belonging, a sense of family, and a sense of hope that had once seemed impossible. And as he watched them laugh, their voices filling the room, Jacob couldn't help but believe that, despite everything they had faced, their story had only just begun. The future, though uncertain, was now a place where dreams could take root, and where the love they had for each other would carry them through whatever came next.